Hey, hold up. State your business and tell me what exactly you want here.
Why do you want to know? This is my establishment. I would like you to tone down the area.
Dealership? Don't play games with me. What were you doing inside that building?
I told you. I own it. I think I'm done answering your dumb questions.
Yeah, I'm not buying that. Turn around.
Officer, you're making a
hands behind your back. Now! What were you doing inside that building?
I told you. I own it.
Officer, you're making a serious
behind your
mistake.
back.
Now!
Police officers make hundreds of decisions during a single shift, but sometimes one decision can destroy an entire career. For Officer Tyler Nolan, that moment happened in the parking lot of Langston Executive Motors when he spotted a 58-year-old black man leaving the dealership and walking toward his car. Instead of seeing a customer, Nolan saw a problem that needed to be confronted. What followed was an encounter so aggressive and unnecessary that witnesses immediately started recording. And before it was over, Nolan would learn the hard way that the man he chose to target was someone he never should have laid a hand on. If you enjoy stories that expose abuse of authority and reveal how the truth eventually comes to light, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. The afternoon had been moving normally at Langston Executive Motors. Customers walked between rows of luxury vehicles while employees wrapped up conversations inside the showroom. A few sales staff stood near the glass entrance, watching a man step out into the parking lot. That man was 58-year-old Nathaniel Langston. Tall, composed, and dressed in a tailored dark suit, Langston walked across the lot toward a black sedan parked near the front row of vehicles. Few people looking at him would have immediately known that he was a federal judge with decades of legal experience. Langston had built a reputation in courtrooms for being calm, precise, and firm when it came to matters of justice. Outside of the courtroom, he preferred to keep a low profile, which is why many customers inside the dealership simply assumed he was another executive finishing business for the day. Across the street, a patrol car rolled slowly past the dealership entrance. Behind the wheel sat Officer Tyler Nolan. Nolan had been on patrol for several hours already, scanning businesses along the road the way he often did during his shifts. As his cruiser passed the dealership, his attention locked onto Langston walking across the lot. The officer slowed the vehicle slightly. From Nolan's perspective, something about the scene immediately bothered him. A black man walking alone through the lot of a luxury dealership didn't sit right in his mind. Instead of seeing a businessman or customer, Nolan immediately started forming his own explanation. "Yeah, that doesn't look right," he muttered to himself. He kept watching as Langston approached his car. In Nolan's mind, the assumption was already made. People like that didn't just walk out of places like this. Maybe the man had been wandering around the showroom. Maybe he had been trying to steal something. He didn't know, but he had already decided it was suspicious. Without hesitation, Nolan turned the cruiser sharply into the dealership entrance. The patrol car rolled quickly across the lot before stopping just a few feet away from Langston. Langston had just reached for his car door when the sound of the cruiser door flying open cut through the quiet afternoon. "Hey!" a voice barked from behind him. Langston turned around slowly. Officer Tyler Nolan was already walking toward him fast, his posture stiff, his tone hostile. "Stop right there," Nolan snapped. Langston looked at the officer, confused but calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Nolan stepped closer, eyes scanning Langston from head to toe. "What are you doing here?" Nolan demanded. "I was inside the dealership," Langston replied evenly. Nolan scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah? Doing what exactly?" Langston kept his voice steady. "I had business here." But Nolan's expression hardened. Instead of listening, the officer took another step forward, his hand resting near his holster as his voice grew sharper. "Don't play games with me," Nolan said coldly. "You don't look like you belong anywhere near this place." Nearby, a couple of employees near the showroom entrance had started watching. Langston remained calm, but Nolan's tone only grew more aggressive. "Go ahead," Nolan said, pointing toward him. "Reach for your pocket. Let's see what you've got." Langston slowly began reaching toward his jacket, and that was the moment the situation started spiraling out of control. Langston's hand had barely moved toward the inside of his jacket when Officer Tyler Nolan suddenly reacted. "Hey, don't do that," Nolan shouted. Before Langston could even explain what he was reaching for, Nolan stepped forward aggressively and shoved him back against the side of the car. The sudden movement caught the attention of several people near the dealership entrance. Two sales employees stopped mid-conversation and turned toward the scene. Langston steadied himself against the vehicle, clearly confused by the officer's reaction. "Officer, I'm reaching for my identification," Langston said calmly. "I didn't tell you to reach for anything," Nolan snapped, his voice sharp and hostile. "You move when I tell you to move." Langston slowly lowered his hand, keeping his movements controlled. "All right," he replied evenly, "then tell me what you need." But Nolan wasn't interested in listening. He stepped closer, invading Langston's space, staring at him with open suspicion. "What exactly were you doing inside that dealership?" Nolan demanded again. "I told you already. I had business there." Nolan shook his head and let out a short, mocking laugh. "Yeah, I'm sure you did." Langston frowned slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying, officer." "What I'm implying," Nolan said, raising his voice, "is that people don't just walk out of places like this unless they actually belong there." Several employees standing near the glass entrance were now clearly watching. Inside the showroom, more people had started looking through the windows. Langston noticed the growing attention but kept his focus on the officer. "I do belong here," he said calmly. Nolan scoffed again. "Really?" he replied, "because right now it looks like you were wandering around somewhere you shouldn't be." Langston took a slow breath. "I'm simply trying to leave." Nolan suddenly grabbed Langston's arm. "You're not going anywhere until I figure out what you were doing in that building." The grip was tight, unnecessary. "Officer," Langston said firmly, "you need to let go of my arm." But Nolan's temper was already rising. "Don't start telling me what I need to do." Near the entrance of the dealership, Eric Anderson, the dealership manager, had stepped outside after noticing the confrontation. He watched the officer gripping Langston's arm and immediately started walking toward them. "Officer, is there a problem here?" Anderson asked cautiously. "Yeah, I'm dealing with it," Nolan replied bluntly. Anderson looked at Langston, clearly recognizing him. "Sir, everything all right?" Anderson asked. Langston nodded slightly. "Officer Nolan seems to think I shouldn't be here." That statement only irritated Nolan further. "You're still not answering my questions," Nolan said, tightening his grip again. "What were you doing inside?" Langston's tone remained controlled. "I told you already. I had business there." Nolan leaned closer, lowering his voice in a way that was both hostile and insulting. "Let me guess," Nolan muttered. "You were just browsing the luxury section too." Langston stared at him calmly. "You're making a mistake." But Nolan was already losing patience. "Yeah? Then prove it," Nolan snapped. Langston slowly reached again towards his jacket. "I'm getting my identification." The movement triggered Nolan instantly. "Don't reach." In one quick motion, Nolan yanked his firearm from the holster. Before anyone could react, he swung the heavy metal across the side of Langston's head. The impact echoed sharply across the parking lot. Gasps erupted from several witnesses. Eric Anderson froze in shock. "Hey, what are you doing?" someone shouted from the entrance. But Nolan wasn't backing down. He stepped forward again, furious. "I told you not to move." Langston slowly straightened himself, blood beginning to show near his temple. Despite the pain, his voice remained steady. "Officer." Nolan pointed the gun toward him, breathing heavily. "Get on the ground now." Langston looked directly at him, and then he said something that caused several witnesses to glance at each other in confusion. "You just assaulted a federal judge." For a moment, the parking lot went completely silent. Officer Tyler Nolan stood frozen, the barrel of his gun still pointed at the man in front of him. "You just assaulted a federal judge." The words hung in the air. Nolan blinked, clearly unsure how to process what he had just heard. Then his face twisted into a scowl. "Yeah, right," he scoffed. "Nice try." Judge Nathaniel Langston remained standing, one hand pressed lightly against the side of his head where the gun had struck him. Blood had begun to trickle down near his temple, but his posture stayed steady. "I'm not trying anything," Langston said calmly. "You're making a serious mistake." But Nolan wasn't listening. Instead, the officer stepped forward again, his voice louder now, almost defensive. "Get on the ground," Nolan shouted. Several people near the entrance of Langston Executive Motors had pulled out their phones. The dealership manager, Eric Anderson, was already moving closer, clearly alarmed. "Officer, that's not necessary," Anderson said. "Stay back," Nolan snapped, cutting him off without even turning around. Anderson stopped, raising his hand slightly. Langston kept his voice controlled. "There's no reason for this," he said. "You asked for identification. I was reaching for it." Nolan shook his head aggressively. "Don't start playing that game now. You think saying you're some judge is going to scare me?" Langston looked at him directly. "I don't need to scare you. I'm simply telling you the truth." But Nolan had already decided what he believed. "Turn around," Nolan ordered harshly. "Hands behind your back." Langston did not move. "Officer Nolan," Langston said firmly, "you've already escalated this situation far beyond what was necessary." The use of his name seemed to irritate Nolan even more. "Oh, so now you know my name too?" Nolan said sarcastically. "You think you're real clever." Langston slowly removed his hand from his head. "I read your name tag." Nolan stepped forward again and grabbed Langston's arm roughly. "I'm done listening to you. Turn around." Langston sighed quietly but complied, turning slowly as Nolan forced his hands behind his back. The metal handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. Several witnesses reacted immediately. "Are you serious right now?" someone said from the crowd. Another voice spoke up near the dealership entrance. "He didn't do anything." Eric Anderson stepped forward again. "Officer, you're making a mistake. That's Judge Langston." But Nolan only rolled his eyes. "Everyone suddenly knows this guy, huh?" Nolan said mockingly. Langston remained calm, even as the officer tightened his grip on the cuffs. "You really should run my name," Langston said. Nolan grabbed the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch," he said into it, his voice still irritated. "Run a name check for me." Langston spoke clearly. "Nathaniel Langston." Nolan repeated it into the radio with obvious skepticism. "Yeah, run Nathaniel Langston." For a few seconds, nothing but static came back through the speaker. The crowd continued watching. Langston stood quietly in handcuffs while blood slowly dried along the side of his head. Then the radio crackled to life. "Unit 24, confirm the name again?" Nolan frowned. "I said Nathaniel Langston." There was a longer pause this time. Several seconds passed. Then dispatch spoke again, their tone suddenly cautious. "Unit 24, stand by." Nolan shifted his weight impatiently. "What now?" he muttered. The radio clicked once more, and the next words that came through made several officers inside the station suddenly stop what they were doing. "Unit 24, the individual you're detaining appears to be a federal judge." Several witnesses standing nearby exchanged confused looks. Officer Tyler Nolan stared down at the radio clipped to his shoulder as if he had heard it wrong. "What?" he said into the mic. Static crackled for a second. Then dispatch spoke again, more clearly this time. "Unit 24, the name you provided, Nathaniel Langston, is showing as a United States federal judge. Confirm the spelling." Nolan looked over at the man standing in handcuffs beside the car. Judge Nathaniel Langston remained calm, even with the metal cuffs around his wrists and dried blood visible near his temple. That's the correct spelling, Langston said evenly. Nolan hesitated for a second before raising the radio again. Yeah, that's the name. There was another pause on the line. Inside the dealership lot, the tension had shifted. Employees and customers were now whispering among themselves, some still recording the scene on their phones. Eric Anderson stepped closer again, his expression serious. "I told you, officer," Anderson said. "That's Judge Langston." But Nolan still looked unconvinced. He glanced at Langston again, then back at the radio. "Dispatch, are you sure you've got the right person?" Nolan asked. The reply came quickly. "Unit 24. Records indicate Nathaniel Langston has served as a federal judge for over 20 years. Several people in the crowd murmured at that. Nolan shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since the confrontation began, the officer's confidence seemed to falter. Langston spoke again, his tone steady. "I told you earlier that you were making a mistake." Nolan didn't respond. Instead, he looked around the lot, noticing the number of phones pointed in his direction. Someone near the front row of vehicles said quietly, "This guy just hit a federal judge." Another person shook their head in disbelief. Eric Anderson stepped closer again, his expression serious. "Officer, you should probably remove those cuffs," Anderson said carefully. Nolan glanced at him sharply. "I didn't ask for your advice." But the radio crackled again before he could say anything else. "Unit 24, a supervisor is being notified to respond to your location." That statement drew more attention from the crowd. Langston remained composed. "You should listen to your dispatch," he said. Nolan rubbed the back of his neck, clearly irritated now. "I'm handling the situation," Nolan muttered. But the tension in the parking lot had already changed. What had started as an aggressive stop now looked very different. Within a few minutes, the distant sound of another police siren began echoing down the street. Several witnesses turned toward the road as a second patrol vehicle pulled into the dealership lot. The car stopped near Nolan's cruiser. The driver's door opened. Out stepped Sergeant Daniel Ruiz. Ruiz had been supervising officers in the district for years, and the moment he stepped out of the vehicle, he could already sense something was wrong. He took one look at the crowd. Then he looked at the man standing in handcuffs, blood near his temple, calm posture, expensive suit. Ruiz's eyes narrowed slightly. He walked toward Nolan. "Sergeant Nolan?" Nolan turned quickly. "Yeah, Sergeant?" Ruiz gestured toward Langston. "Why is this man in handcuffs?" Nolan shrugged slightly. He was acting suspicious. Ruiz studied Langston carefully. Then he spoke again. "Did you run his name?" Nolan nodded. "Dispatch says he's some kind of judge." Ruiz looked directly at Langston. Their eyes met, and after only a few seconds, Ruiz's expression changed because he suddenly recognized exactly who was standing in front of him. Sergeant Daniel Ruiz stared at the man standing in handcuffs for a few seconds longer. Then his expression hardened. He turned his head slowly toward Officer Tyler Nolan. "Take the cuffs off him," Ruiz said. The instruction was calm but firm. Nolan blinked in confusion. "What?" Ruiz didn't repeat himself louder. Instead, he stepped closer to Nolan. "You heard me," Ruiz said. "Take the cuffs off now." The tension in the parking lot thickened as witnesses watched the two officers. Nolan hesitated. "Sergeant, he was acting suspicious. I saw him walking out of the dealership and—" "I don't care what you thought you saw," Ruiz interrupted sharply. Ruiz turned slightly toward Langston again, now clearly recognizing him. "Sir, are you Judge Nathaniel Langston?" Ruiz asked. Langston nodded once. "Yes, I am." That confirmation changed the atmosphere instantly. Ruiz exhaled slowly, clearly realizing how serious the situation had become. He turned back toward Nolan. "I told you to remove the cuffs," Ruiz repeated. Nolan reluctantly reached for the handcuffs and unlocked them. The metal restraints clicked open, and Langston slowly brought his hands forward again. Several witnesses murmured as the cuffs came off. Eric Anderson stepped closer, still shaken by everything he had seen. Ruiz looked directly at Langston. "Judge Langston, I'm very sorry about what happened here," Ruiz said. Langston rubbed his wrists briefly where the cuffs had been. "Your officer struck me with his firearm," Langston said calmly. The words made Ruiz glance sharply toward Nolan. "Is that true?" Ruiz asked. Nolan shifted uncomfortably. "He reached for his pocket," Nolan said defensively. "I thought he might be pulling something." Langston spoke again. "I told him I was reaching for my identification." Several people nearby immediately spoke up. "That's exactly what he said," one witness added. Another voice followed. "The officer just lost it." Phones were still pointed toward the scene. Ruiz noticed them immediately. "How many people recorded this?" he asked quietly. A few hands lifted in the crowd. "Several of us," someone replied. Ruiz nodded slowly. He then looked back at Nolan. "You pulled your weapon and struck him?" Ruiz asked. Nolan crossed his arms. "I was controlling the situation." "No," Ruiz said firmly. "You escalated the situation." Nolan didn't answer. Langston stood quietly beside the car, still composed despite the dried blood along his temple. Ruiz looked at him again. "Judge Langston, do you need medical attention?" "I'll be fine, but this incident needs to be documented." "Yes, sir, it will be." He then turned back toward Nolan. "You're done here." Nolan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ruiz stepped closer. "It means you're no longer handling this situation." Nolan looked irritated. "I was doing my job." "No, Officer Nolan, your job is to protect the public, not assault them." The crowd grew quieter. Ruiz held Nolan's gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "Hand over your weapon." Nolan's eyes widened. "What?" "Your weapon," Ruiz repeated. The seriousness of the command finally seemed to sink in, because everyone in that parking lot understood exactly what was happening, and Officer Tyler Nolan was beginning to realize that the encounter he started just minutes earlier was now spiraling completely out of his control. Officer Tyler Nolan stood there for a moment, staring at Sergeant Daniel Ruiz like he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "Hand over your weapon." The command hung in the air. Nolan glanced around the parking lot. Phones were still pointed at him. Customers, employees, and passers-by were all watching closely now. "This is ridiculous," Nolan muttered. Ruiz didn't respond emotionally. His voice stayed steady. "Your weapon, Officer Nolan." Slowly, Nolan unclipped the firearm from his duty belt and handed it over. Ruiz took it without another word. The situation had completely flipped. Just minutes earlier, Nolan had been the one shouting orders. Now he stood silent while his supervisor controlled the scene. Ruiz turned slightly toward Judge Nathaniel Langston. "Judge Langston, again, I apologize for what happened. Internal Affairs will be notified immediately. This incident will be investigated." Langston nodded calmly. "I expected nothing less." Eric Anderson stepped closer to Langston, clearly concerned. "Sir, do you want us to call medical services?" Anderson asked. Langston shook his head lightly. "No, I'll be all right." But he did glance once more toward Nolan. "For the record," Langston added, "this entire encounter began because your officer decided I looked suspicious simply for walking out of my own business." Several witnesses nodded immediately. "That's exactly what happened," someone said from the crowd. Ruiz looked toward Nolan again. The officer now stood quietly, his confidence completely gone. Ruiz spoke firmly. "Officer Nolan, you are being relieved of duty for the remainder of this shift. You will report to Internal Affairs first thing tomorrow morning." Nolan's jaw tightened. "You're suspending me over this?" Ruiz didn't hesitate. "No," Ruiz replied. "Your actions did that." The weight of the moment was obvious to everyone watching. Phones continued recording as Nolan walked back toward his patrol car, no longer the aggressive officer who had stormed across the parking lot earlier. Within days, the footage recorded by witnesses spread quickly. What people saw in those videos raised serious questions about Nolan's conduct and the assumptions that led to the encounter in the first place. The department opened a full investigation. Body camera footage confirmed the sequence of events, the aggressive approach, the racial assumptions, the escalation, and the moment Nolan struck Judge Nathaniel Langston with his firearm. The findings were clear. Officer Tyler Nolan had violated department policy, used unnecessary force, and escalated a situation that never should have happened. Shortly after the investigation concluded, Nolan was officially terminated from the department. Judge Nathaniel Langston returned to his courtroom, continuing the work he had done for decades, upholding the law and ensuring accountability. But the incident at Langston Executive Motors left a lasting lesson. Sometimes the abuse of authority is exposed in the most public way possible, and when it is, the truth has a way of catching up. If you believe officers who abuse their power should always be held accountable, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.